see, I'm going to be talking mainly about childhood obesity, taking the British case study of the policies that have been recently imposed to try to reduce obesity in general and childhood obesity. Now, you will see that several of us are from the International Union of Nutritional Sciences, and I thought that some of you might not know about this international organization, so I just want to say a few words about that before I begin. To get more details about it, you can look at this website that I put up at the top. And we've also distributed a few leaflets around the room if anybody wants to look at it. So there are just two main activities of IUNS. Every 4 years there's an International Congress of Nutrition. The last one was in Buenos Aires. The next one in 2021 will be in Tokyo. And we also throughout the 4 years, have task forces. These task forces look into particular issues that are of special interest, and these are the task forces that exist at the moment during this session. There are several of them, and you can see that many of them are directly related to the topic of this conference, especially the last two in that list, sustainable diets, which also includes the environmental changes, climate changes, and the traditional and indigenous food systems and nutrition. Just a mention of a couple of previous task forces. We had InFoods, and that has now progressed to become an affiliated body of IUNS. And you might notice that obesity is not amongst the current task forces, and that is because we used to have a task force, but it developed into something much larger. It was then called the International Obesity Task Force and is now the World Obesity Federation. So that's the sort of thing that develops out of IUNS. Now, we're celebrating 100 years of nutrition at this institute. And obviously, 100 years ago, the main problem was undernutrition. And even in Europe, we have a hunger map of Europe in 1918. And this is showing areas where we've got conditions of famine and near famine and food shortages. But of course, we've heard yesterday and today about the reduction in the proportion of people that are undernourished in all sections of the world. That doesn't mean the problem is solved. There's still many things that have to be dealt with as far as undernutrition is concerned. But what we're talking about is a much more recent problem of the prevalence of obesity. And here we can see the rise of obesity since 1975 up until near the present time. The problem is highest in North America and Europe and Oceania. And although it's very low in Asia compared with these other countries, you can see that it's rising, and it's therefore going to become much more of a problem. So the way that people are dealing with it in other countries will become useful information in the future. We have both adult and child obesity. Now, there are various approaches to how we deal with nutrition. In the past, many people have put the sole responsibility on the individual. That's to say that there's plenty of food around, we just eat what we feel we should be eating. People say, all you need to do is eat less. And in fact, this is what my husband always says. This is his policy for dealing with nutrition. It's obviously an important factor, but obesity is much more complicated than that. We also have exhortations from government and nutritionists to eat 5 a day. So that's to eat 5 types of vegetables and fruit a day, and so on. So we get plenty of nutritional advice. People are helped by various things, such as we have the Eat Well guide, shown on the left here, which shows that the proportions of the different food groups that we should be eating, and different countries have similar guides. And we also have food labeling, so that we can see what proportion of fats and sugars and salt and so on are in the particular foods that we're eating. However, there's now a much wider acceptance that we live in an obesogenic environment. And this is both related to food and activity, or lack of activity. For example, in the UK, in 2015, 18% of meals were eaten out of the home, and there's a tendency for these meals to be much higher in sugar, fat, salt, and the portions tend to be much bigger. Therefore, this increasing consumption of meals outside the home is one of the important factors in the rising level of obesity. Therefore, apart from people restraining their own eating, the whole food system really has to be addressed. We've been hearing about food production, food processing, there's problems of retailing, promotions in stores, such as 2 for the price of 1. Advertising is an important component, restaurants, canteens, and of course government policy. Now, in the UK, in 2010, there was quite a major reorganization of the health system, both of the national health system and of public health. So here we have the strategy for public health in England that was produced at that time. The background to this was that people realized that Britain had become one of the most obese countries in Europe, and also health inequalities were getting worse. If we compare richer and poorer areas of the country, people were dying 7 years earlier in the poor countries, the poorer sections of the country, and they lived with ill health for 17 more years. This was all described very clearly in Sir Michael Marmot's report on Fair Society and Healthy Lives. He is a great expert on inequalities in the country. So the government decided to have a new approach and to end central control of public health. They wanted to pass the responsibility to local government to improve people's health throughout life, from childhood to old age, to reduce inequalities, and also to focus on local needs rather than having policy organization of the health service. They were supposed to be working collaboratively with industry and the voluntary sector. And this started through what was called the Public Health Responsibility Deal. The Public Health Responsibility Deal was a public-private partnership which involved voluntary pledges. And this was between government, industry, and other organizations to improve public health. So the process was that any business could sign up to certain core commitments to recognize the vital role of industry in improving people's health and help them with healthier diets and more physical activity. And there were 5 networks: food, alcohol, physical activity, health at work, and behavior change. So if we just take the food industry pledges, the industries that signed up to this had to provide calorie information for food and non-alcoholic drinks for customers, both in and out of home settings. commit to salt targets, remove artificial trans fats from products, and help people to increase their fruit and vegetable consumption and to reduce their calorie consumption. So this approach went on for a while. It was then evaluated by several researchers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They did a systematic review of the evidence of effectiveness of these 6 food pledges. And the conclusions they came to were that the progress reports were really overall a rather poor quality, so it was difficult to see how much had improved. But they recognized that most partners had committed to interventions that were already underway, so it wasn't something new that they were doing through the pledges. They noted that voluntary agreements really had to push partners to go much beyond what they would be doing normally, so beyond the business as usual. But the most important outcome of this was that they showed that the food pledges did not reflect the most effective strategies to improve diet. For example, food pricing, restrictions on marketing, and reducing sugar intake. So there are many pressures for change away from this voluntary association. There was widespread dissatisfaction with these voluntary agreements, and from about 2013 there were many organizations that campaigned for a tax on sugar-sweetened drinks, and they petitioned the House of Commons with more than 150,000 signatures. Another thing that happened about that same time in 2015 was that the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, this is a committee that looks at all the scientific evidence for the relationship between different factors in the diet and health, and they look at very many different issues. In this one they were looking at carbohydrates, and they came up with new guidelines in which they said that sugar consumption should be reduced to 5% of the total calories. Previously the recommendation had been just 10%. So this means a dramatic change in the amount of sugar that should be in the diet. In the same year, a bit later, the House of Commons Health Select Committee that looks into policies that the government should be taking into account, they said that the scale and consequences of childhood obesity demand bold and urgent action from the government. Then on the international scale, in the next year, 2016, WHO came up with a Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity, and the same year we had the beginning of the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition. So the scene internationally did change about that time. Now here we can see the extent of obesity in the UK. In the top panel on the left, these are children in what's called reception. That's the first year they go to school at the age of 5. And 1 in 4 of these children is overweight or obese. The next panel is when they leave primary school at the age of 11. And there it's gone up to 1 in 3 children is overweight and obese. And then when we come to the adults, 2/3 of adults are overweight and obese. And the cost of this to the nation is enormous. If we see on the bottom panel to the left, this is the annual cost to the National Health Service of all the diseases and problems that are related to obesity, And this has been estimated to amount to £6.1 billion. But that's only to the NHS system. If we look at the cost to the whole economy, it's very much larger. It's 27 billion. And in just the last 2 days, there's been an announcement that taking 10% of the expenditure of the National Health Service. So apart from the welfare of people, economically it's a disaster. And another very recent report, just from last month, is that record numbers of 11-year-olds are now classed as severely obese. This is from the National Child Measurement Programme. Now, if we see, so for childhood obesity in the UK, this is one of the highest levels of childhood obesity in Europe. And there's a strong correlation between deprivation and the prevalence of obesity. Now, you'd think that the richer people are, the more likely they would be to be obese. These are the deciles of deprivation. So on the right, we've got the most deprived, and on the left, we've got the least deprived. And here we have the red columns show the obesity at reception, so at 5 years old. And you can see, if you compare the left-hand one to the right-hand one, you've got twice the prevalence of obesity in the most deprived groups. And this is the same ratio in the 11-year-old children. So eventually, in 2016, the government came up with the Childhood Obesity Plan for Action. And the ambition of this is to halve childhood obesity by 2030. Now, I'm not going to go into all these points that are involved in the Plan for Action, but I've highlighted the ones that are related to food in red. The ones that are related to activity are in black, but we won't talk about these as this Congress is about food. So I'm only going to be talking about calorie reduction and sugar reduction. Now, there's obviously excess calories in some children's diets, and according to food intake surveys, overweight and obese children consume excess calories. So, for example, boys consume up to 500 calories per day excess, and girls up to 290 calories excess. Then this is especially sugar. Teenagers in England are the biggest consumers of sugar-sweetened drinks in Europe. I mentioned that the Scientific Advisory Committee concluded with sugar that it increases the risk of excess calories, tooth decay, type 2 diabetes, and higher weight in children. And with their advice of reducing this to less than 5% of the calories, if we look and compare that with the reference energy requirements of children, which ranges between about 1,500 and 2,500 calories, depending on the age of the child, if you calculate that and the amount of sugar that would be, that means that they would have to be consuming less than between about 20 and 30 grams per day. But a single soft drink of 330 mils contains up to 35 grams of sugar. So just one soft drink would be over the maximum recommended daily intake. So they came up with the sugar reduction program in 2016. They claim that this is the world's first sugar reduction program on this scale. They put the challenge to the food and drinks industry to reduce sugar over a whole range of products by at least 20% by 2020 and by 5% in the first year. And this would be through reformulation of the foods, so there's less sugar in it, reducing portion sizes. People have recently noticed that chocolate bars are much smaller than they used to be, or else shifting purchases to lower sugar alternatives. And they said that if there was insufficient progress by 2020, they would use additional levers to persuade the industry to make these reductions. And they warned that the sugar reductions should not be replaced by fat, for example. So it had to be accompanied by calorie reductions. The initial focus of this program was on the 9 categories with the largest contribution to children's sugar intakes. So these, as you can see, are cereals, yogurts, ice creams, sweets, chocolates, cakes, etc. So these are the products that industry has to reduce the sugar. And this comes from the evidence that we have of where sugar comes from in children's diets. And around the right-hand side of this disc, you see most of these products. Now, on the left-hand side, the big blue section, this is the soft drinks, which are then covered by another policy. This is the soft drinks industry levy. So this is really the first time that the government has taken really mandatory changes. They announced a tax in 2016, and this just came in force in April of this year. So each industry would have to pay a levy if they produced a drink that had any sugar added during production, and if it contains at least 5 grams of added sugar per 100 mils. The rates of the levy are 18p per litre if the drink has 5 grams of sugar or more, and if it has 8 grams of sugar or more, the rate is 24p per litre. And it was planned that the revenue from the new levy would then be invested into school food and physical activity programs. Now, some drinks were exempted from this levy. Juice and milk drinks were exempted because they have more nutrients in them than just the plain soft drinks. So what are exempted are the milkshakes, sweetened coffees and chocolates, fruit and vegetable juices and smoothies. But these were still included in the sugar reduction program, which was the more voluntary one, not one that is mandatory. And then for these, the drinks industry and milk drinks by 20%. So what progress has there been? Well, this is the latest information we have about progress, and this came out in May of this year. There's been certain important successes, particularly in the reformulation of products that the children eat and drink most. As far as the soft drinks industry levy, the majority of the industry actually reduced the sugar content of soft drinks before the levy came into force. So they knew that this would happen and they wanted to avoid the levy. So we've already seen an 11% reduction in sugar per 100 mils and 6% reduction in calories. Many companies have reduced sugar in their most popular food products. For example, Kellogg's have cut between 20 and 40% of sugar from the most popular products for children. But overall, there's been a 2% reduction in total sugar per 100 grams. But they have not met the 5% reduction target for the first year. So the government has said that they may have to include the sugary milk drinks in the levy and introduce legislation ending the sale of energy drinks and consider further tax system to promote healthy food, including mandatory and fiscal levers, if the industry fails through voluntary reduction programs. Similarly, for calorie reduction, in 2017, all food and drink companies of products reducing portion size and encouraging consumers to purchase lower calorie products. And these, you see, are the categories of food covered by the program. Progress in this, by June of this year, only a minority of companies have included calorie labeling on their menus. So the government is now planning to mandate consistent calorie labeling for the out-of-home sector, that's restaurants and so on. And in the meantime, they put this out for consultation, which will end in December. I want to discuss. There seems to be a battle between government and nutritionists and industry. Obviously, the food and drink industry has an essential role in our urban environment, and profit is essential also for these industries. But most of the industries do have an interest in health, and they have to make changes as science advances. But the problem for a government is that whether they should make voluntary agreements with industry or make them mandatory. Generally, they prefer to have voluntary agreements, but they're increasingly accepting the need for mandatory regulations. And there's a lot of public criticism that government is too close to industry. Here we have another example from last month from the Times, that various experts that have been advising the government are threatening to stop advising them because they have too close links with the drink industry. So finally, what is the future? This is the projected rates of obesity. This has been shown by the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And they indicate that in the future, up until 2050, is that? Or 30, obesity is going to continue rising. But we're hoping that with some of these policies that are just being instituted, that we may be able to have a downturn instead of a continuing increase in obesity. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
My question was when we have similar things in Chile, and they have reduced sugar in many of the foods and beverages and have replaced them by sweetener, which is not that much better. How did industry do it in the UK?
I think the industry is doing it in the same way, either replacing it with artificial sweeteners or just reducing the amount of sugar, perhaps not with additional sweeteners. So it's the same issue, really.
Thanks.
Yeah, there is no more question allowed. Now we are going.
There was one up there.
One more question.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll just jump in. Excellent talk. Could I please ask you, who reads nutrition labels?
Sorry, who reads?
Who reads them? Who reads nutrition labels? It's a question really about equity and whether it's the worried well who read nutrition labels or whether it's poor people who are eating high-fat, high-sugar products.
I think probably very few people read nutrition labels. It would only be the most educated and the people that understand what they're about. I think most people wouldn't understand what percentage of the recommended allowance is shown on the labels. So it is there for people that are educated, but I think it's probably not very successful overall.
Once again, I thank Catherine